banker stood inside the old milk house and dragged the toe of his boot through a drift of dust and dead leaves on the concrete floor. He stopped near the center, where a patch of cement had been troweled flat over what used to be a drain. "Dry dairy," he said. Arthur Bell stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light. "Dry?" he asked. "No well of record," the banker said, checking his clipboard. "Pump's gone off the windmill. Pond's dead. Milk house is obsolete." He said it the way a man reads a diagnosis, not looking for an argument. Outside, a neighbor leaning against his truck called through the open door, "A dairy farm without water is just a barn with a memory." Arthur didn't answer right away. He was looking down at the floor, at a row of pale rust rings stamped into the concrete where milk cans had once stood in a line, waiting on a truck that hadn't come down that road in 30 years. The bank saw no water. Arthur saw 48 gallons that had once needed cooling before sunrise. Arthur Bell was 55 years old in the spring of 1986, and he bought the 80 acres in southern Missouri, not because he believed in ghosts of the old dairy trade, but because the price was low and the barn roof, unlike most things about the place, still looked sound. He'd spent a stretch of his younger years driving a milk route, hauling cans from small farms, just like this one, to the creamery in town, before the big co-ops and bulk tanks put an end to that kind of work. Most people who knew him thought of him as the man who used to drive the truck, not a dairyman in his own right, and Arthur had never much minded the distinction. He wasn't buying this place to reopen a dairy. He needed pasture for 16 calves and a handful of cows, and he needed it cheap. The farm came with an old stanchion barn, a milk house built of concrete blocks standing off to one side, and a windmill tower with no pump left on it. 24 acres of rough pasture, 18 in hay ground, 11 in brush that had crept in over whatever fields once got cropped. A shallow pond out past the barn had sat dry, or close to it, for longer than anyone could say for certain. The county had no clear well record for the place at all. The listing had called it what the banker called it now: dry old dairy ground, buildings obsolete, no modern water system. A drilled well would run him somewhere between $8,900 and $10,400 by the two quotes he'd gathered before closing. After the down payment, Arthur had roughly $2,300 left to his name, nowhere near enough to gamble on a hole in the ground that might or might not hit water. Where other men read the farm through the county file, Arthur read it the way he'd once read a milk route, by what had to be true for the thing to have worked at all. He'd started clearing the milk house that first week, mostly to make room for tools, sweeping out decades of dust and mouse nests and old feed sacks. In a warped wooden drawer built into the wall, stuck half shut with age, he found a handful of yellowed milk tickets, a few faded creamery tags, some route notes in a stranger's handwriting, and underneath all of it, a ledger book dated 1954. He sat on an overturned bucket and read through it by the light coming in the door. Page after page carried the same entry, in different hands across different weeks, but always the same number. 48 gallons cooled before morning pickup, not once, not as a story somebody had told him secondhand. Written down day after day, week after week, in a farmer's own plain hand. Arthur sat with that ledger a long while. A dairy farm without water, everyone kept telling him, was just a barn with a memory. But you couldn't cool 48 gallons of milk on memory alone. Before electric coolers reached places like this, small dairies kept milk cool the only way available to them. Cold water, and plenty of it, held close to where the cans sat waiting. The ledger did not tell Arthur where the water was. It told him the water had to be there. He went back into the milk house and looked at it differently this time. The rust rings on the floor matched the exact diameter of a milk can's base. The floor itself wasn't level. It sloped, gently but unmistakably, toward the patched drain in the center. A low stone shelf ran along one wall, set at just the right height to keep cans steady if they'd once stood in shallow water rather than dry concrete. The north wall stayed noticeably cooler than the rest of the building, even at midday, and outside, past a stretch of brush nobody had cleared in years, a narrow ditch kept a stubborn patch of sedge and moss alive through a summer that had killed off most everything around it. Milk house did not need water far away. he wrote in his own notebook that evening. It needed cold water underfoot. Arthur didn't call a well driller. With the little cash he had, he hired an old mason he knew from his hauling days to come look at the floor, and together they broke open the cement plug someone had troweled over the drain years before. His neighbor thought it was the strangest thing he'd seen a grown man spend money on. Arthur, the banker, said when he heard about it, "A drain is where water leaves, not where water comes from." "Sometimes it tells you where it used to come from," Arthur said. For a while, it looked like the drain had nothing left to tell him. The first morning after they broke the plug, all that came up out of the opening was black mud and the smell of old wet leaves, no flow at all. A few days later, when they'd cleared enough to reach the old clay tile beneath the floor, water finally moved, but it came out the color of strong coffee, thick with silt, nothing a man would want near a stock tank, let alone a milk can. Then a length of the tile gave way under its own age while Arthur was working it loose, forcing him down on his knees with a hand trowel, clearing the collapsed section inch by inch in the close, damp dark under the floor. The banker, hearing about the torn-up floor, warned him that breaking into the milk house like that would only knock the building's value down further, not build it up. His neighbor came by one afternoon, looked at the mess of mud and broken tile scattered across what used to be a dairy floor, and didn't hold back. "You tore up a dry dairy," he said, "and found wet dirt." Arthur sat with the ledger again that night, running his thumb down the column of matching numbers, and let himself doubt it for the first time. Maybe the milk hadn't been cooled with spring water at all. Maybe it had been hauled down to the creek each morning, or cooled some other way he hadn't thought of, and the ledger was nothing more now than a record of a routine that had died along with everything else on this place. The ledger had proved 48 gallons had been cooled. It had not proved the water was still alive. He almost let it go at that. But going back through the book a second time, more carefully, he found a line he'd skimmed past the first time through. North drain cleared after storm, can set by 6. He looked up from the page toward the milk house's north wall, the same wall that stayed cool no matter how hot the day got outside. Outside that wall, past the brush he still hadn't finished clearing, Arthur found what the ledger had been pointing him toward all along, an old stone box, half buried under a tangle of roots, with a length of clay line running from it toward the milk house foundation. Further up the slope, a seam in the hillside showed the unmistakable dark stain of water that had been moving, on and off, for longer than the dairy itself had stood. The screen at the box's opening had rusted shut, packed tight, with silt gone hard as clay. Arthur and the mason worked it loose together, clearing root and sediment out by hand the way you'd clean out an old spring, not rushing it, not forcing anything that might collapse the stonework around it. When the screen finally opened, the water didn't rush or roar out of the hillside. It simply began moving, cold and clear, down through the old channel, and under the milk house floor exactly the way it must have moved 50 years earlier, back when a farmer set his morning cans in it before the truck came down the road. It came back the way dairy water should come back, not loud, cold. The mechanism wasn't complicated once Arthur understood it. Before bulk tanks and electric cooling, a small dairy like this one needed cold water close at hand every single morning, water cold enough to hold milk at a safe temperature until the truck arrived. Here, that water had come from a hillside spring, channeled through a stone box and a length of clay tiles straight under the milk house floor, where cans stood in shallow, moving water instead of open air. When the dairy closed, nobody kept that channel clear. Roots grew into the screen, silt packed in behind it. At some point, somebody troweled cement over the drain inside, maybe to keep the floor dry, maybe just to be rid of the smell, and the county's own records lost track of the well or spring that had never been formally documented in the first place. The water hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply lost the path that once made it useful. The farm had not lost its water. It had lost the path that made the water useful. Arthur didn't try to rebuild a dairy operation out of what he'd found. He fixed the drain properly, replaced the collapsed section of tile with new pipe, packed fresh gravel and a new screen around the spring box, and ran a line to a used stock tank he set up outside near the calf lot. The mason's time, the broken cement, the hand digging, new tile, screen and gravel, the tank, pipe and valve, came to around $1,400, a fraction of what a drilled well would have cost him and money he could actually spare. Once cleared, the flow settled between 1 and 1.5 gallons a minute, enough to fill the storage tank slowly overnight, enough for a small group of calves and a garden, nowhere near enough to run a commercial dairy again. Arthur never once suggested it could be. That August brought a hard drought through the county. The pond stayed dead. The creek dropped to a trickle. Neighbors up and down the road hauled water in truck-mounted tanks, and the grass everywhere but Arthur's calf lot turned the color of old straw. Arthur's line kept filling the tank a little at a time each night, and he didn't waste a drop of it. He watered the calves in small groups, kept a float valve on the tank so it never overflowed, fenced off the spring box itself so nothing could trample the ground around it, and checked the screen every morning before he did anything else, the same habit he'd once had checking a truck before a route. A neighbor stopped by one morning and looked at the tank sitting half full in ground that hadn't held standing water anywhere else on the place in weeks. "That from the ledger?" he asked. "From what the ledger made me look for," Arthur said. He avoided close to $2,000 in water, hauling that summer, money he didn't have to spend and couldn't easily have found. When he sat down with the bank that fall, he brought the milk ledger itself, photographs of the rust rings and the restored spring box, the drain and tile receipts, his flow log, a water test, and notes on how the calves had come through the drought. The banker looked over the original note on the file, "Dry old dairy site." He crossed it out and wrote in its place, "Spring-fed milk house with functional stock water." "It still won't milk 48 gallons again," he said. "I don't need it to," Arthur answered. "Then what do you need it for?" "To keep from selling what I've got." The same neighbor who'd laughed at him over the torn-up floor came by not long after and stepped into the milk house, dipping 2 fingers into the shallow channel of water still running steady beneath the old shelf. "Cold," he said, surprised. "Had to be," Arthur said. "You found that from a book?" "From a number," Arthur said. They had listed the dairy farm as dry, and from the road it had looked exactly that. The windmill carried no pump. The pond held nothing but weeds. The milk house smelled of dust and cement and years of mice before Arthur ever set foot inside it. But the ledger hadn't cared what the county had forgotten. It had only recorded what had happened, morning after morning in a farmer's own hand. 48 gallons, cooled before pickup, not once, and not as a story passed down secondhand, but written down again and again until the number stopped being a memory and started being a fact a man could follow. A number like that doesn't prove a spring exists, but it proves a need once existed, and needs, on an old farm, rarely go unanswered by accident. Arthur followed that need backward, past the rust rings on the concrete, past the cemented drain, past the collapsed tile and the roots choking an old stone box nobody had opened in decades. And under the milkhouse floor, the water that had once cooled 48 gallons every morning was still cold, still moving, waiting on somebody to clear the path back to it. The bank had seen a dry dairy. The neighbor had seen a dead barn. Arthur had seen 48 gallons that once needed morning water. And by August, that forgotten water was filling a stock tank again. If stories about forgotten farms, old water systems, and the records that outlast the buildings they describe mean something to you, subscribe to Old Farm Wells and tell us where you're watching from. Would you trust a county listing or a milk ledger that says 48 gallons were cooled every single morning?